Every generation thinks it's finally solved the economic puzzle. Every generation is wrong. For more than 100 years, two ideas have been fighting for control of the world. Not quietly, not academically, loudly, violently, across borders through revolutions, depressions, propaganda, and war. Capitalism versus socialism. Not just as theories, but as systems that promised meaning, security, and a better future. Supporters on both sides swear the other failed because it was corrupted, implemented incorrectly, sabotaged by enemies. Never truly tested. But history is less forgiving than ideology. Because when you zoom out far enough, a disturbing pattern emerges. No country ever lived inside the clean, perfect version of either system. And when pressure arrived, war, famine, inflation, collapse, both systems revealed the same uncomfortable truth. They didn't behave the way the textbooks promised. Welcome to The Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. To understand how this fight began, you have to forget modern politics for a moment. Forget markets, wages, stocks, and GDP. For most of human history, none of that existed. There was no economy. There was survival. For thousands of years, wealth meant land. Power meant force, and most people owned neither. Kings ruled by divine right. Nobles controlled territory. Peasants worked the soil just to avoid starving. Trade existed, but it was limited. Innovation was slow. Productivity barely moved. A farmer in the year 1200 lived almost the same life as one in the year 200. Human progress crawled. Life was a zero-sum game. If someone rose, someone else fell. Wealth didn't grow. It was taken. Through conquest, inheritance, or exploitation. The idea that ordinary people could become wealthy through invention or business would have sounded insane. Then everything broke open. In the late 1700s, Britain became the most important accident in economic history. Coal, iron, capital, colonial trade, and political stability collided at the same time. Machines replaced muscle. Steam replaced animals. Factories replaced workshops. For the first time ever, productivity exploded. One worker could now produce what once required dozens. Goods became cheaper, output surged. And a new force emerged that had never existed at this scale before: private capital. Individuals, not kings, could invest, take risks, own factories, control production. Wealth was no longer fixed to land. It could grow. Fast. This was the birth of capitalism, not as a theory, but as a reality. And it worked. Brutally well. Cities expanded. Trade networks spread. Britain became the workshop of the world. Other nations followed. Europe transformed. Then America. But the speed of change was violent. Workers flooded into cities faster than infrastructure could handle. Slums formed. Pollution choked the air. Children worked 12-hour shifts. Wages rose for some and collapsed for others. Inequality widened at a pace society had never seen. Capitalism created wealth, but it did not create fairness. And that contradiction planted the seed of its greatest rival. Socialism was not born in comfort. It was born in factories that smelled of smoke and blood, in crowded tenements, in riots and strikes and hunger. By the mid-1800s, thinkers like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels looked at industrial society and reached a radical conclusion. The problem wasn't bad employers. It wasn't corruption. It wasn't greed. The problem was the system itself. They argued that capitalism extracted value from workers while disguising exploitation as opportunity. That profit came from unpaid labor. That inequality was not an accident, but a feature. Their solution was elegant on paper. If workers owned the means of production, factories, land, machines, the wealth they created would be shared. No more boom and bust. No more exploitation. No more poverty caused by private accumulation. Production would serve human needs, not profit. It sounded moral, rational, inevitable, and for millions crushed by early capitalism, it sounded like justice. But theory does not care about reality. Reality always cares about theory. The first real attempt at socialism did not happen in a wealthy industrial democracy. It happened in a collapsing empire. In 1917, Russia was exhausted. World War I had drained its economy. The monarchy fell. The elite fled or were killed. The state collapsed. Into that chaos stepped the Bolsheviks. Lenin inherited a country that was poor, largely illiterate and starving. And yet, the new regime attempted something unprecedented. They wiped out private ownership. Land, factories, banks, all nationalized. Prices set by planners, production dictated by quotas. Markets eliminated. On paper, it should have worked. In practice, it didn't. Without prices, planners had no real information about demand. Without competition, factories had no incentive to improve. Without personal reward, workers did the minimum required. Shortages became permanent, lines became normal, waste skyrocketed. Agriculture collapsed into famine. Even Lenin realized the system was failing. He allowed limited private trade just to keep the country alive. But despite this, socialism did not die. Because capitalism, at the same time, was unraveling too. By the early 20th century, capitalist economies were booming, but unstable. Speculation ran wild. Monopolies dominated industries. Wealth concentrated at the top. Workers lived paycheck to paycheck. Then came 1929. The stock market crashed. Banks failed. Credit evaporated. Businesses collapsed. Unemployment surged to levels never seen before. This was not a normal downturn. It was systemic failure. The Great Depression shattered confidence in capitalism worldwide. Entire countries watched their economies implode. Savings vanished. Hunger spread. To many observers, capitalism looked broken beyond repair. By the 1930s, the world faced an uncomfortable reality. Socialism produced equality in theory but scarcity in practice. Capitalism produced wealth but also collapse. Neither system delivered what it promised. Then history applied maximum pressure. World War II. The war forced every major economy to operate under extreme conditions. The Soviet Union used central planning to mobilize its population and industry at terrifying speed. The United States turned private companies into an industrial war machine. Both systems, in their own way, worked under command. But after the war, the real test began. From 1945 onward, the world split into two experiments. On one side, centrally planned socialist states. On the other, regulated capitalist democracies. This was not a debate anymore, it was lived experience. In the Soviet Union, early decades brought real gains. Industrialization surged, education expanded, military power grew. But beneath the surface, inefficiency multiplied. Factories met quotas by producing useless goods. Innovation stalled. Technology lagged. Consumer quality collapsed. By the 1970s, the USSR could build nuclear missiles but could not produce reliable household appliances. Capitalist countries learned from failure. Governments regulated markets, created safety nets, broke monopolies, insured banks, built public infrastructure. Capitalism did not become fair, but it became adaptable, and adaptability turned out to matter more than ideology. By the 1980s, the gap was impossible to ignore. Living standards in the West surged, the Soviet economy stagnated. The Cold War was not decided by speeches. It was decided by productivity. When the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union was not defeated by invasion. It collapsed under its own economic weight. Empty shelves, broken incentives, political elites replacing economic ones. A system built to eliminate inequality created new hierarchies. Power simply changed form. But capitalism's victory was not clean, because after the Cold War, capitalism mutated again. Finance expanded faster than production. Debt replaced wages. Corporations went global. Inequality surged to levels not seen since the Gilded Age. Then came 2008, another collapse. Another reminder that instability was never solved, only postponed. At the same time, socialism returned in softer form. Not total state control, but calls for healthcare, education, regulation, and redistribution. And that brings us to the present. Almost no country today practices pure capitalism or pure socialism. Every major economy is a hybrid. Scandinavia combines markets with strong welfare. The US mixes innovation with inequality. China blends private enterprise with state control. History forced compromise. We answer the real question. Not which ideology is right, but why power always concentrates, why systems fail the same way, and what actually determines whether an economy survives the future. If showed us how capitalism and socialism rose, collided, and fractured under pressure, answers the harder question. Why do these systems keep failing in such familiar ways, even when they look completely different on the surface? Because by the late 20th century, the ideological war was supposed to be over. The Soviet Union collapsed, central planning lost credibility. Free markets spread across the globe. History, some claimed, had reached its final form. But reality had other plans. The victory of capitalism did not produce stability. It produced speed, and speed without balance has consequences. During the 1990s and early 2000s, global capitalism entered a new phase. Production moved offshore. Supply chains stretched across continents. Finance stopped serving the economy and began dominating it. Credit became the engine of growth. Instead of earning more, people borrowed more. Housing turned into an investment vehicle. Stocks disconnected from productivity. Banks created complex financial instruments few understood, including themselves. The system looked strong. Profits soared. Markets climbed. Growth appeared endless. Then it snapped. The 2008 financial crisis was not an accident. It was a structural failure. The same one capitalism had experienced before, just wearing modern clothing. Excess leverage. Misaligned incentives. Concentrated risk. Privatized gains and socialized losses. When it collapsed, governments stepped in. Trillions were injected. Banks were saved. Markets stabilized. But something else broke permanently. Trust. Ordinary people watched as institutions responsible for the disaster were rescued, while households lost homes, jobs, and savings. Wages stagnated. Inequality widened even further. Capitalism survived again. But it survived by bending its own rules. And this is where the debate shifted. The question was no longer capitalism versus socialism. It became something more uncomfortable. Who does the system actually serve? Because every economic system, no matter the ideology, faces the same enemy: human behavior. Greed does not disappear under capitalism. It is rewarded. Laziness does not disappear under socialism. It is tolerated. Corruption does not disappear under planning. It hides behind bureaucracy. Power does not disappear under markets. It concentrates through wealth. Different systems. Same tendencies. That's the pattern history keeps revealing. Look at power. In capitalism, power flows through capital. Those who own assets shape markets, politics, and policy. Over time, wealth compounds. Influence follows. In socialism, power flows through the state. Those who control planning committees, ministries, and enforcement gain influence. Over time, political elites emerge. The mechanism changes. The outcome doesn't. Power concentrates. This is why pure systems fail. Unrestricted capitalism eventually undermines itself. Monopolies form. Competition weakens. Inequality destabilizes demand. Crashes become inevitable. Pure socialism collapses under information failure. Without price signals, planners guess. Without incentives, productivity stalls. Without accountability, corruption thrives. Neither system escapes human nature, so what works? Not ideology, constraints. The most stable economies in history are not those that picked a side. They are the ones that built mechanisms to limit damage when people inevitably abuse power. That is the real lesson of the last century. Take Scandinavia. These countries are often labeled socialist, but that label is misleading. They have strong private property rights, competitive markets, and global corporations. What makes them different is not ideology, but design. High taxes fund public services, strong unions balance corporate power. Transparent institutions reduce corruption. Markets exist, but they are constrained. The system accepts inequality as a byproduct of incentives, then actively limits how destructive that inequality becomes. Now look at the United States. America represents capitalism pushed close to its limits. Innovation thrives. Capital flows freely. Risk-taking is rewarded. But guardrails are weaker. Healthcare is tied to employment. Education creates lifelong debt. Housing becomes speculative. Infrastructure decays while wealth concentrates at the top. The system still produces enormous value but distributes risk downward. This isn't failure. It's imbalance. Now look at China. China is the most misunderstood economic experiment in modern history. Officially socialist, practically authoritarian capitalism. Private firms drive growth. Markets operate. Entrepreneurship exists. But the state controls land, finance, and strategic sectors. When markets conflict with political goals, politics wins. This hybrid delivered historic growth. It lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty. But it also created massive debt, property bubbles, and demographic crisis. Again, not ideology. Trade-offs. Every system solves one problem by creating another. And now, a new pressure is building. The 21st century doesn't care about old debates. Artificial intelligence threatens labor markets. Aging populations strain pensions. Climate risk demands long-term planning markets struggle to provide. Debt levels limit government flexibility. These challenges expose weaknesses everywhere. Capitalism struggles with patience. Markets prioritize short-term returns. Long-term investments with uncertain payoff, climate resilience, infrastructure, population stability, are underprofited. Socialist-style planning struggles with innovation. Central control moves too slowly. Technology evolves too fast. Creativity resists command. So what determines survival? Adaptation. History doesn't reward purity, it rewards flexibility. Capitalism survived the 20th century not because it was perfect, but because it evolved. From laissez-faire to regulated markets. From industrial capitalism to welfare capitalism. From national markets to global finance. Socialism collapsed where it refused to change. Where ideology mattered more than results. Where incentives were treated as immoral rather than necessary. But socialism survived where it merged with markets. Where planning focused on safety nets instead of total control. This is the uncomfortable conclusion. Economic systems don't fail because they are evil. They fail because they are rigid. And rigidity is fatal in a world driven by human behavior. Which brings us to the real question most debates avoid. Who controls the levers? Not workers versus capitalists. Not markets versus states. Institutions, rules, feedback loops, accountability. When markets fail, does the system correct itself or protect insiders? When governments fail, can citizens respond or are they silenced? When inequality rises, does opportunity remain open or become inherited? These questions matter more than labels. Because the real enemy of prosperity is not capitalism or socialism, it is unchecked power. History shows this clearly. Wealth without restraint becomes oligarchy. Planning without accountability becomes repression. Different paths, same destination. The future will not belong to the most ideological societies. It will belong to the most adaptable ones. The countries that can combine incentives with protection. Innovation with stability, markets with oversight. Growth with legitimacy, not because compromise is noble, but because reality demands it. The great debate of the last century taught us something simple and deeply uncomfortable. No system can save us from ourselves. But good systems can limit the damage, and that is why the argument never really ends. Every generation inherits a system shaped by past failures, then pushes it until it breaks again, then rebuilds it differently. Capitalism versus socialism was never about economics. It was about who holds power and how easily that power can be abused, and that question is still unresolved. If this gave you a clearer lens on history, power, and money, subscribe. Because the answers aren't hidden, they're just buried under ideology. And history always tells the truth.